In this, we'll take a look at what is Express.js. We'll understand why do we need to use Express.js. We'll understand how to install Express.js. Then we'll move on to understanding the components of Express.js. Then we'll understand how to route HTTP requests in Express.js. Then we'll understand the request methods that are available for HTTP. Then we'll understand the templating, how to do templates in Node.js and Express.js. And finally, we'll take a look at some of the most common templating engines in Express.js. So let's take a look at what is Express.js. Express.js is a web application development framework that's based on Node.js. So it's an application development framework that has been written using Node.js, and it's used to develop server-side web applications. It takes care of a lot of common things that you need to perform if you are building a web application. So things such as parsing the request, routing the request, error handling, etc. So the way it works is that a framework basically automates or creates a lot of code for you so that you can leverage that code and could just use that code to perform the common tasks instead of you having to write the code to do this from scratch. So instead of you having to read the entire request body, then parse it correctly and separate it into key value pairs and then use them, Express will do it for you. It'll automatically take the request, convert it into an object that you could use in Node.js, and then you need to just write the code that you need to handle that request. It can also take care of other things like routing, which we'll take a look at in a moment, and also error handling. If something goes wrong, then how to handle that. If a page that the person requested is not available, what to do, what request, what method to send, and so on and so forth. So why do you need Express.js? Well, as already discussed, an Express.js is just a framework that allows you to not worry about tasks that are commonly repeated, but it has several benefits over other frameworks, and we'll take a look at them one by one. The first one is it's fast. Express.js is a really small framework. It's something that's called a micro framework. So a micro framework is basically a framework that provides a really thin layer of abstraction over your normal day-to-day tasks. It's not pre-bundled with a lot of libraries and code that you need to include in your project. Only the things that are absolutely required to build a web application framework is included, and you could add other things on top of it. So if you want to use handle some sort of very specific database application, then you have a library, you can plug it into Express.js and it'll work just fine. So since it's a very small framework, there's not a lot to learn. It doesn't slow down your application development. It doesn't slow down your application while it's running. There's not a lot of code that needs to be bundled and then sent across the stream to the server. It's going to be really small. Your application will not have a really large size just because you're using Express.js. It's very minimal. So since it's a micro framework, it provides only the fundamental web application features. It does limit it in certain ways, but for instance, if you're building a small application, Express.js is really good for that. If you're building a large application and you need certain libraries for certain tasks, Express.js doesn't provide any pre-configured backends for those. You could very easily plug those libraries inside instead of having to configure or already existing one to not work and then adding the new one. So Express.js is really minimal and it doesn't have a lot of libraries pre-packaged with it. Then it's unopinionated. So many frameworks such as Ruby on Rails and other frameworks have their own opinions, which they call convention over configuration. So what happens is that they have some defaults set which is there, and you can then go on and change those defaults, but those defaults have been set there by industry standards. Express.js on the other hand doesn't provide you with any defaults. If you want to structure your application in a certain way, you can do it without needing to reconfigure the entire application, going to config files, setting the paths, and they were doing everything by hand. It frees you in a certain way, but on the other hand, the disadvantage of this might be that you need to think about the structure of your application before beginning. On the other hand, opinionated frameworks have their own structures, whether you like them or not. Some allow you to change the structure, but it could be a bit of a hassle. It's very simple. Express.js, since it's minimal and unopinionated, it's very simple to use. It's very easy to get started with it. The documentation is quite extensive, and there's not a lot to learn when you're trying to use Express.js. It does the basic tasks that you need it to do, and it does it well. And it's unobtrusive. Express.js is unobtrusive, and that basically means that we can use Express.js however we want to use it with any library of your choice. So So if you want to use it with a MongoDB backend, you can use it. If you want to use it with an SQLite database, you can use that. You can use any application, external application concerns like database systems, caching systems, file object storage, whatever you want to do, you can do using Express.js. So installing Express.js. If this is the first time that you are trying to use web development, then you've never worked with all of these tasks, then it could be a bit difficult for you to understand how to install Express.js. But since we are using Node.js, we will be using the Node Package Manager, also called the NPM, to install Express.js for our project. So we will be installing it using Node NPM, Node Package Manager. Now to install Express.js in a Node application, the first thing we have to do is we have to generate an NPM project. So only after we have generated the project, the basic project skeleton using the command npm init-y, the -y flag makes it easy for us to not answer all the complicated questions that it asks right at the beginning while setting up the project. You'll just accept the defaults and move on. This could be changed later, and after you run this command in the folder that you want to create your project, you will have a file called package.json. That is the file that you need to then bundle with your application so that other people could install the dependencies that you have asked for. So after generating the project, we would run the command npm install express-save. Basically, we are just telling npm to install Node Package Manager to install the Express library or the Express framework so that our project could require it, and we use the -save attribute. It's not really required, but I like to keep it in, mainly because when you do it, it saves it in the package.json file, and whenever someone else looks at your application and looks at package.json, they can understand that your application depends on Express.js to work. Now we have to make sure that the --save flag and not the --save dev flag is used, mainly because --save-dev flag is used to install the development dependencies. So dependencies that are only required for development, and when we deploy to production, we don't need it. However, Express.js is something we will need in a production environment that we'll be using. All right, so now let's take a look at how to install Express.js. Okay, so what we want to do is, this is the folder in which we want to initialize an npm project, and then we want to install Express.js. So to do it, firstly I'll open a command prompt in this folder. As you can see that I have command prompt that's opened into the C users, my username, desktop, and node folder. This is the folder that I have opened as of now. Just clear the screen. And the first thing that I have to do is I have to initialize a project. I'm going to press enter. Okay, I think I typed -y, and these are the questions that it would have asked if I had not passed in the -y flag. It would have asked me the name, the version, the description, and all that. Since we don't want to pass it all off, you can see that it's already written to a package.json file, which is this one. Let me just open it. And if I want to change any of this, I could. However, there's no need because it's working just fine. And right after this, I have to install Express. So to do it, I can just type npm install express-save. I press enter, and it'll take some time, but it'll install in a few moments. It's taking a look at the dependencies that are required for us to resolve Express.js. What happens is it takes a look at the packages that it's dependent on and the list of packages that they are dependent on, so on and so forth. And it keeps on resolving them again and again and again. And when it's done, then it closes it off and installs everything and verifies everything is installed. And then it gives us a success message. So let's see how it happens. So it's going on. It's firstly fetching the metadata. Metadata is basically data about the libraries that we're about to install. Now it started to install, and it has installed everything. As you can see, there are no errors. There are two warnings, but they are about the description and repository field in a package.json file, so it's fine. Now to make sure that we have it installed, as you can see, right after I installed it, there's a package-lock folder file created. Open package.json again. Let it open. And as you can see in the dependencies, Express has been added and the version that was installed is 4.17.1, right? So after that, again, to make sure that it's installed properly, I will go into the node modules folder. This is where everything is installed. And if I take a look at a folder named Express, I'll be more than it will be more than easy to find. And this is the Express folder. So this is the entire code for Express.js. If you want to take a look at it, you can. It's recommended that you don't fiddle around with the code here because it could cause a lot of problems in the project that you have. If you do end up messing it up, if you do end up, or if you're distributing this project or sending it to someone else, you can just omit the node modules folder. As you can see, I've removed everything. So now if everything I want to install all the packages that my project depends on, all I have to do is I have to go npm install. It'll take a look at the package.json file. It'll take a look at the dependencies list and it will install everything that I want to. Because Express.js has been cached in the background, it will install quite quickly. As you can see, it rebuilds the node modules folder. And if I open this, as you can see, everything's installed and it's back at where we started it. So as you can see, everything's there. We have the Express, request, response, and all the files. So this is how you install Express.js. Now let's move on to the next topic. Alright guys, so now let's take a look at the components of Express.js. So Express.js has several components. We'll take a look at them one by one. So the first component is request. So Express.js builds a request object automatically, which gets populated with important data such as the request method, the headers, the request data that was sent, which is either the form body or the query strings that have been populated using the URL query strings, so on and so forth. So what it does, it takes a look at the response, which is just a plain text response, contains headers and all the required information that we need, contains the content type and all that. And we take a look at the request, we process it, we parses it, and it converts it into a request object that contains all the relevant data that we might need from the request. There's also a response object. So the response object is basically just an HTTP response that gets sent back to the user. It allows us to build that response and then send it back to the user, and it takes care of processing that request and converting it into text and appropriate format, and then sending it off to the client. So it takes care of a lot of things behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about how to format those responses, how to calculate every bit of information that you need in the response. You only need to fill in the information that you actually need. Then there's middlewares. So a middleware is basically a function that gets called during the request response cycle and has access to the request and the response objects. So these are the kind of functions that get called whenever a request comes in and it's being transformed into a response. So to give you an example, let's say that you send in a request that contains form data. Now that form data needs to have a token associated with it, and you can add a middleware there that when the request is being processed, we want to firstly take a look at the data that has been sent back from the request. And in that request, does it contain a token, and is it a valid token? If it's a valid token, then we can move forward with processing the request. If not, then we can send back an error. So these are the kind of things that middleware come in. You could also use authentication if you're using session-based authentication. You could also take a look at many other things like JSON Web Tokens. You can take a look at if the data is gzipped or not, or do you want to gzip the data that is being sent back to the user, so on and so forth. So that's what a middleware does. Then comes error handling. So Express.js comes with default error handler that will catch any synchronous or asynchronous error that might come across. So if you are working with a lot of data or asynchronously or maybe synchronously, it could be that your application runs into an error. Now, instead of your server actually crashing, what Express.js would do would catch that error, would process it, either log it to the console or send it back to the user so that they can take a look at the error message and understand what's going wrong. And that way you can define your own error handlers as well if you don't like the way that the default error handler is handling the requests. It also allows you to define your templating libraries so that you could make use of any HTTP or HTML template that you might want to create. So since Express.js is unopinionated, we can use any templating language. We could use EJS, which is embedded JavaScript. We can use Jade, we can use Pug, we can use Nunjux. There are many templating libraries available for Node.js. Now we'll take a look at some of them in a later slide, but as of now you do understand that templating allows us to create a skeleton in which we can fill the dynamic data that we want to and send it back to the user. So it allows us to build an HTML response with dynamic data pretty easily. And Express.js allows us to use many different kind of templating engines. And finally, databases. So as we all know, any application that needs to store user data needs to have a database in the backend. So Express.js allows us to connect to many sorts of databases. If it has a library for you to connect to database, then you can connect to it. So npm on the Node package manager registry, there are a lot of packages available for connecting any kind of database that you want. So you could just download it, install it on your project, and then use it. Since Express.js is unopinionated, it doesn't worry about how you use that database driver or the database libraries. You can just use it the way you want to and just perform the operations that you need to get the data that you want, and you can move ahead. So with that, you could just load the appropriate data and forward it to Node.js, and it'll take care of everything else. There are many other components of Node.js as well, but these are the most important ones. So let's take a look at a simple Express.js app and how to build one. So now let's take a look at the setup we have, and we'll understand how to get started with a sample application. So what we have here is just a script.js file. It's in the same folder in which we had previously installed the Express.js packages. We have created the package.json file by initiating the project. And now all I have to do is I have to write some code. Firstly, I'll require the Express package. Then I'll create an application out of it, calling the function. And I'll just add a route. When I get a request, when I get a GET request, I will use them. This function will take a look at the request and the response and will send a response.end, and the response should be hello world. And finally, I'll have to listen the port 8000 and a callback function that will be called after the connection has been established on port 8000. So save it and run it. As you can see, the callback has been run, which means there have been no errors. If I open the localhost, run it again, and as you can see, we have this. Now if I want to go to any other page, I might not get any response, let's say H, and cannot get H. That's a 404 error because we don't have any route to respond to that. If I want to, I can create another route similar to this, and I could type /H, save it. And if I refresh this, it's not going to work because I have to close it and then restart it again. That will reload the changes that I've made. And as you can see, we have this for the H and we have for the home page as well. So let me just remove that. So hopefully this gives you some idea of how this is working. We are declaring a route and we are passing the request along that. Alright guys, so now let's take a look at HTTP routing in Express.js. So Express.js comes with a built-in router. So what a router does is it takes a look at the HTTP request that comes in, takes a look at the URL that the request has come from, and responds to it accordingly. And if the request that comes from a URL is not supposed to be responded by your web server, it sends back a 404 error saying that the resource that you're trying to access, it's no longer available or it's not available. So the router allows you to write code that handles request to a particular route effectively. So a route could be an HTTP web address or a URL on your domain. Let's say that your domain is example.com. So a request to www.example.com/login would be a request to your site. However, if for the user to view the sign in page, they need to go to example.com/sign-in, then your application will respond with a 404 error to the login page request. So just make sure that you understand what routing is. It basically just means responding correctly to the correct addresses. Now, in Express.js, router has methods to respond to, or any or all of the 7 HTTP methods. So there are many HTTP methods, and Express.js has a router that responds to all of them. Each method is used to perform a specific action on the server. So for instance, there are some of them are get, put, post, patch, delete, and there are a few others as well. And all of them are used to perform a specific kind of task on the server based on the data that they send with that request. So let's take a look at these request methods and what they allow us to do. So there are 7 HTTP request methods. The first one is get. So the get method is used to request the server to return some data that is either a collection or an entity. So to break it down, so let's say that you have built an Instagram like website. So an entity would be just one Instagram post or one photo, and a collection would be a group of those photos. So when you take a look at one photo, that's an entity, and when you take a look at someone's profile, they have multiple photos that get back from the server. That's a collection of those entities. So get method basically asks the requests the server to return some data back to it. That's what a get request is for. Then there's post request, and post requests are usually used to submit some data for further processing on the server. It could be for the data to be stored in the server's database for things like form submission, sign up, login, so on and so forth. It could also be that you are not persisting in the database, but you're just trying to check whether or not the data is correct, as in the login credentials of a person. You want to take a look at whether or not given username exists, and does the password that has been provided match with the given username, and then you can move along. There's also put. So put is used to update data. Put and patch, both of them are used to update data. The main difference is put is used to completely replace an entity. So if you have, let's say that you are on Twitter, you have a tweet and you want to change it completely. You don't want to edit the tweet, but you want to change its contents entirely. Then that tweet would be sent via a put request. Things like the entire content of the body, the requests and all that, and all the likes, shares, and everything is resetted. Then that's a put request. On the very other hand, that's patch. Patch is used to just send some partial data to be replaced of an entity on a server. So to give you an example, let's say that you have a form that you had submitted. Let's say that you have a blog post that you had submitted that has the entire user and the entire title and the body of the blog post. Now you have noticed an error in some spelling or some typo in your blog's heading, and you want to change that. Now to change that, you could either send the entire heading and the copy and paste the entire body and send it again. But what you can also do is you can use the just send the title and tell it to keep everything as the same as it is. That is when we use the patch method. Then there's delete, and I think delete is self-explanatory. It's used to delete an entity on the server. So delete takes in the request, takes in some data that could help you identify the entity, such as the ID or anything else that could uniquely identify one entity on your server, and then it deletes that entity for you and sends back the result of whether or not the delete was successful or not. Then comes options. So options and head, both of these are not that much used, but options are used to describe the communication options for the target resource. What are the operations that it supports? For instance, if you want to make use of the REST API that someone has provided and want to make sure that you are performing the appropriate operations, you can call the options request method, and you can take a look at operations that are available for that entity. Can you get the data? Can you post it? Can you put, patch, or delete, send these kind of requests, so on and so forth. And then there's head. Now head is also not that much used, but it's used to get the response that is the same as the get request, but without the response body. So we are only interested in the headers of the response. Let's say that you want to check whether or not getting request to some entity is going to be successful or not. So instead of getting the entire response body, which could take some time to build, you can respond to a head method, which will just take a look at the query and will respond with a status code that will describe whether or not the operation was successful. You don't want the response body because it could take a lot of time to build and it could take a lot of resources as well. So you just want the header, and that's where the head request comes in. So now with that in mind, let's take a look at how to do routing in Express.js. Okay, so let's take a look at the setup. So this is again a script.js file, and we'll be implementing a few more routes and understanding how to register them. So the first thing I'll do is, again, I'll have to import express using the require keyword. And we have created the Express app. Now let's register some routes. So I'll register a get route for, let's say, the home page. Let's just response to time, and I'll register home page. Let me register 4 more routes. About us. You could register more. Let's just register 2 more. Services. And finally, let me just help. If I save this, all I have to do now is listen on port 8000, and let's just register a callback method in which I'll just console log that everything went fine and we are now listening on 8000. Now I have to run this. If I run this, okay, I'm getting an error. Require is not okay. I've misspelled require. Let me just okay. So run this again. As you can see, now it's working. So if I go to localhost 8000, sorry, refresh it, we are getting home page. If I go to the other routes, about, we're getting about page. Services, we're getting services, and help, and I get help. So we're working fine. And other methods that you could use would be app.post, and you could register routes for that as well, and it'll work just fine as well. So we can create multiple routes, and they can be using multiple methods as well. So if you want to create one for post, patch, put, delete, we can just register it using, instead of get, we can use post, put, patch, etc. And they'll work with the respective request methods. Alright guys, so now let's take a look at templating in Node.js. So let's take a look at what is templating. So Express.js can be easily integrated with a lot of templating engines. Well, templating basically means that when you have a lot of dynamic content on the web application and you want to display it to the user, there are some parts of the web page that you don't want to change. But for an example, take a look at the profile page of your Facebook profile. When you take a look at your Facebook profile and take a look at your friend's Facebook profile, you can see the structure is the same, but there's some dynamic content that's changing, namely your name, your username, the number of friends that you have, but mostly the structure is the same. So that's what templating is. It defines the structure and leaves out the places for dynamic content to be added later. So what templating does, it takes a look at the template that you have created, the structure, and it takes the dynamic data that needs to be put into that template. It dynamically inserts that data, generates the HTML output, and then sends it back as a response There are many templating engines available. Some do one thing better than the other, and you need to take a look at these templating engines to understand which one you want to use. But since Express does not ship with a default templating engine, you can either create your own, or you can download a package that does the templating for you. Now, for instance, there are many templating engines which we'll take a look at in just a moment. Creating your own templating engine might not be that hard. If your needs are really small, then you can do it yourself as well. But it's highly recommended that you use the already existing templating languages or the templating engines that are already existing, mainly because they come with powerful features. They are not difficult to install and they have been battle tested. So any sort of security issues, bugs, errors that people might have run into have already been resolved. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the templating engines available for you to use in Node.js. So there are many templating engines on NPM and they can all be integrated with Express.js. Here are some of the most popular ones. The first one is EJS. It stands for Embedded JavaScript. So it is one of the easiest templating engines that you can understand, that you can use. It's very easy. If you already know JavaScript, then the syntax is going to be very familiar to you. It's very easy to understand. It's very easy to use. So you can take a look at EJS. It's very easy to set up as well, and it's, I think, very lightweight also. So you can take a look at that. Then there's Mustache.js. It is one of the most popular templating frameworks out there, and it's available in a number of programming languages. Right now we are doing it in Node.js, which is the server-side version of JavaScript, but you could use it in client-side JavaScript as well, or you can use it in other languages like Ruby or Java or any other language that supports templating using Mustache.js. So Mustache is a templating library. Mustache.js allows you to use it in Node.js or JavaScript, any other JavaScript environment. And it's very easy to use as well. The documentation is really good, and it's an older version. It's been around for a long time, so it's very mature and has a lot of features. Over the years, it's been developed quite well. Then there's Handlebars.js. So it's another popular templating language, and it's a superset of Mustache.js. So basically, it means that at any feature that you can find in Mustache.js, you can find in Handlebars.js as well, and there are some additional features added on top of it. So additional features means more things to learn and more ways to do a thing. If Mustache.js is something that fulfills your requirements, then you can use that, or take a look at Handlebars.js and use that as well. Then comes Nunjucks. So Nunjucks is developed by the Mozilla Foundation. Developers at Mozilla have developed this templating syntax. It's extremely powerful templating language, and it's really simple and easy to use. Its syntax is inspired by the Jinja 2 templating language in Python. So if any of you have ever worked with Jinja 2, you can just jump into Nunjucks and use that instead of the other templating languages. Or you can try it out. It's easy to use. It's very fast. The speed has been one of the more major contentious issues when developing Nunjucks, and it's very easy to understand as well. The documentation is quite good. And then there's Pug. So Pug was previously known as Jade. It's by far the most popular templating language in the Express.js community. So if you're building a database dynamically generated web application, which dynamically generates the content and sends back the HTML request instead of building an API, then chances are, if you're using Express.js, then Jade is by far one of the most popular options for you. It's very easy. It's been around for a long time. Many developers have contributed a lot to it, so you can take a look at that as well. So now let's take a look at templating using EJS. So the first thing that we have to do for it to work is take a look at package.json. So we only have Express installed as of now, and we want to install the EJS package as well. To do that, I'll just use the npm install EJS-save, press enter. We'll start in a moment. And it's installed. Now if I take a look at package.json, you can see that it's installed. So we'll use it using Express. So again, I'll have to first require Express.js. I have to create an Express instance. And now I have to configure the EJS setup. So to do this, I'll have to first set a property called view engine, and I have to set it to EJS. That will instruct Express to use EJS for any templates that I load. Express already knows that I have installed the EJS package, so it will just use that. Now let's just create a route. and I'll create a home route in which you get request and response, and you use response.render and you type in the name of the view. Let's call it index.ejs, and let's pass in some dynamic data as well. So let's say there's a dynamic property called name, and the name is John Doe. Let's say that you're building a profile and you want to display the user's name. Now all I have to do is listen on port 8000 and have a console.log that log to the console that we are listening on port 8000. Save it, so it's working. Now that that is done, let me just show you what it is. So in index.ejs is in a file called views. So as you can see, it's in C users my username, then desktop node, and there's a file called index.ejs. Now that is not going to work. So to make it work, I would have to firstly go to index file, and inside the views folder there's an index.ejs. I have to open that, and here's the code that will be running. So let me just explain it quickly. It's the basic HTML code. The only bit of dynamic content is this, and what we're showing here is we want to display something that is dynamically passed using EJS, and it will be called name. So what will happen is our server will receive a request for the home page. Then our Express.js will take a look at this part and understand if we want to render index.ejs, which is inside the views folder index.ejs file. Then it'll pass in this dynamic property, and EJS will take a look at this entire content, and will take a look at this and realize that it has to replace this with whatever the content of name is. In our case, it's John Doe. So that should work. So if I want to run this, I have to type node script.js, press enter. It's looking for the code. I go for localhost /8000, and as you can see, it's sharing with John Doe. So it's working correctly, and our code is working fine as well. And with that, we've come to the end.